Hey there everyone, my name is Sarah and welcome to Novel With Me, the series which takes you on a writing journey from start to finish. We have spent the past 2 weeks talking about world building and we've got a couple more weeks to go. Sorry. Today we are going to be looking at law, education and economy, the backbone of your country, I guess. This is the beginning of your society within your world. These can be determined by the different cultures that you have created, or they can be different. These can be determined by culture. They can also be determined by where your city or your provinces are within your kingdom. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the law. Now, there are a few areas within law itself that we need to talk about, and those are going to be crime, order, law, and punishment. That's right, we're going to talk about law within the law. You'll get what I mean when I get there. The reason we're going to be talking about all of these is because even though they are slightly different from law itself, they sort of fall under the same umbrella and one will affect the other. Everything affects everything in world building. I say it all the time. I'm not going to stop because it's not going to stop being true. We'll start from the bottom and we'll work our way up. Crime. What determines crime in your world? Now, you could go the standard route of murder and theft, but there are some cultures where they might not be seen as a crime, or you could invent one where they are not seen as a crime. It's completely up to you and the culture that you've created. Now, the same crimes will probably be committed throughout your world, but different countries, different cities, different areas are going to see a higher rate of certain crimes. Fantasy has a habit of creating guilds, like the Thieves Guild or the Assassins Guild, especially in the bigger cities. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I've done it myself in my very first novel I ever wrote back 10 years ago or so. But the point I'm trying to make is, are there similar organisations in your world? Maybe not guilds, but you have things like organised crime, the mafia, drug cartels, etc., etc. These sorts of things that you can think about and inspire you to add into your own novel. Do the city's locations help determine what type of crime occurs in them? If you're a coastal city, you might see more pirates. You're right there on the sea. But if you live in a rural area, you're probably more likely to see outlaws or bandits. Location, climate, the culture within certain areas helps determine what sort of crimes go on within them. So it's a really important thing to think about. I say that a lot, don't I? And what about things like forgery, bribery, or other white-collar crimes? Are these plausible in the world that you've created? If so, try and figure out a way to put them in there. Crime is multi-layered by nature, and committing one will often lead you to committing another. Order. Who maintains the order? There's got to be someone. Who enforces the law and hunts down the criminals? Who keeps the peace? Is it a large organisation, like the police in our world, or is it a small group of people, like the sheriffs back in the Wild Wild West? Again, this will depend on the size of your city. What's the procedure after catching a suspect? They're going to be locked up, of course, but are they questioned? How? Is torture the norm for getting information out of someone, or is interrogation more the way you go? Is there a limit on what officials are allowed to do to get the information out of someone, or does anything go? This can tie in brilliantly to government and politics, which we spoke about last week. There's the thing up there. There are some elected officials who might say, you know what, do whatever you need to do to shut this person up, to make sure they do not speak out against me. It's because they're within the same system. Law is a part of your government. The government will somehow control how the law works, and in that sense, the people in charge, the people in power, whether they're doing it by the books or underhanded, are going to have a say in how the law is handled, I guess. I'm really trying to paint a really corrupt picture of a world here, aren't I? Well, we get inspired from the world around us, I suppose, so yay. Speaking of corruption, no institution is without it, of course, in some way or another. Can your officials be bribed or bought off in any way? Depending on what sanctions you have, the royal guard, or the equivalent, those that look after the king or queen or who are directly employed by the people in power, are less likely to accept bribes or be bought off than, say, the lowly guards patrolling the streets, having to break up fights, chase down thieves on foot. Are there those who take payment, perhaps from other businesses in order to protect them, or from criminals to make them look in the other direction? Or maybe those who try and cheat the system in order to hide their own criminal activity. Next we come to the laws. What laws exist in your world? Do they cover just crimes, or are there other laws that control aspects of people's lives, like being unable to buy something at a certain age, or not being able to take one sort of produce across the border to another area of the country? These laws can be as simple or as complicated, as smart or as dumb as you need them to be in order for them to fulfill whatever culture, whatever country you are trying to create. Smaller nations, smaller countries are probably going to have fewer laws, and I guess the people there are more likely to abide by those laws because they're much more of a community than, say, in a much larger city or country where nobody knows anybody, nobody speaks to the neighbour, and you're able to sneak around and get away with a lot more stuff. Next, you need to think about the system for implementing these laws once the suspect has been caught. What happens next? Having a hearing is usually that next step, but is it in front of the king himself? Is it a jury of peers, a judge? Or does the victim get to decide upon a punishment based on the crime? The severity of the crime, depending on what laws you have in place, will probably determine who oversees the judicial proceedings and implementation of the law at hand. King, for example, isn't going to bother himself with some thief that stole bread. He's going to care about the noble who, committed treason. You need to figure out what procedures and systems are in place in your world and which crimes determine which procedures to be used. And finally, punishment. Do all who are found guilty share the same punishment, like jail time? Probably not. Is there a different punishment for smaller crimes than there is larger? And what type of punishment do you use? You can have small punishments like fines or imprisonment. You've got the physical punishments, which could be a flogging or cutting off a thumb or a finger or branding someone as a thief. Maybe the crime warrants a public execution or banishment from the country in which you live. And do these punishments change depending on wealth and stature? A fine is not punishment for someone who's rich. It's short change. So if a noble commits the same crime as a poor person, do they get the same punishment? Or is there a way for the noble to weasel himself out of that punishment? When you think of the law, you need to think about how it can be upheld, how it can be broken, and how people can get around it. Because if you've thought of it, the characters within your novel can think of it as well. Except for death. Except if you're on a supernatural. Education. Every culture has some sort of education system, whether that is based on acquiring knowledge or based on acquiring skill. When you think of academics, I suppose the first thing you need to think about is what type of system you want to have. How young are children when they start learning? If you do have an actual school system, who's able to attend? Is it free for everybody, rich and poor, to mingle together? Or is it something that only the rich can afford to go to? Does this create a knowledge gap between the rich and the poor, like it did in the old days, where the poor never knew how to read and write? Or do those who are less fortunate learn another way, like homeschooling? Does gender play a role in learning at all? or is education even required? If someone wants a specific job, is there an academic path for them to take, or is higher learning reserved for only those who seek a high-powered job? What route does someone take to become a healer or an educator or a judge, for example? Are there apprenticeships people can do instead of learning or going to school, like blacksmithing or being a baker? Is the system the same throughout the entire country, or does it change depending on the population size and where you live? A massive city might have a school system, but a small village in the middle of nowhere probably won't. I'm asking a lot of questions. That's the best way to world build, says I. Economy. Economy is another aspect of world building which is heavily determined by your geographical location and your climate. Economy is all about the management of your country's resources. How can you make your country money and get the goods that you can't produce yourself? It's all about trade, supply and demand. Your country needs to make money somehow. Or if money isn't that important to your culture, it needs to make sure that there are enough resources for everyone to be able to live properly. You decide what your culture wants to focus its wealth and power on. First of all, of course, you need to decide what resources your country has. And like I said, this is determined by the geographical location. And each different area of your country might offer a different resource for trade than another. If you live in a mountainous region, you might have more mining opportunities for things like precious metals. If you live in an area with great soil and great farming opportunities, of course, you might be trading your fruits and vegetables, perhaps even livestock, especially if it's something that only grows within your country. That makes it a high commodity and perfect for bartering trade. Next, you need to decide how rare or valuable your resources are. How much are they worth? And what resources your country is lacking. Or maybe there's no real need for trade at all. Maybe the rich and powerful in your country just prefer some oranges grown over on that side of the world than they do in their own backyard. Production is another important thing to think about when you think about economy. How are your products produced? Which resources have the biggest production? And how much labour is required to fulfill optimum output? And how much labour is required to fulfill optimum output? Do you have factories, machineries, or is everything handmade? If you have a farm, do you make all of the products on site? Or do you ferry every single ingredient over to a different area for them to put together to form another product for you? Distribution comes next, and that's super simple. How do you transport your goods from point A to point B? Is it by foot, cart, horse and carriage, boat? What sort of transport exists in your world? Does everyone come together at a market in order to buy and sell their goods? Or do you have travelling salesmen who go from city to city? And don't forget about currency. Who could forget about currency? It's what makes our world go round. How do your people pay for goods and services? Most fantasy stories will have the standard gold, silver and bronze coins. But this is a place where you can really use your imagination. What about precious gems or chunks of metal, shells or beads or a certain type of stone? Something that is hard to find in nature but is also easily controlled. Are there banks in your world? Who lends money to the poor? Is lending even a thing? These are all the small things that you need to think about in order to create a realistic economy within your world. Because it's world building, a fantasy world where everything has to be logical and realistic. If these elements I spoke about aren't important or focused on in your novel, if these elements aren't important or focused on at all in your novel, then don't feel the need to actually figure them out before you start, or figure them out at all. World building is all about going to the depths that you need to go to for your novel, so don't feel pressured into having to work out every small little detail. In the description below is a link to a Just the Basics blog post which references everything I've spoken about today, and a writing worksheet for you to get started planning your own, stuff. In the description box below is a Just the Basics blog post which references everything I've spoken about today, and a writing worksheet for you to use however you see fit. Novel With Me returns next week for World Building Part 4, the final part. No more world building after next week. You made it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Good thoughts and happy writing!